Welcome back to Politico's AI Summit. In this panel, we'll be talking about the global cooperation around AI. Joining me today are Anne-Marie Engtoft Larsen, who's a tech ambassador, who's Denmark's tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, Karina Cho, who's a global policy lead for emerging technologies at Google, David Van Vel, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, and Yi Zheng, who's a Director of AI Ethics and SDGs at the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence. Before we start, a few housekeeping notes. Don't forget to submit questions via the Swapcard app in the question box next to the live stream. And you can also answer our poll, which is, how can different countries and intergovernmental bodies working on AI governance best reconcile their views? Feel free to also tweet using the hashtag #PoliticoAI. Now, I'd like to ask all of our panelists a very quick question. Who do you think is leading in AI right now? Why don't we start with Anne-Marie?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure to be speaking, and I think one of the most important topics of our time. The short answer, I think, when we look at where the patents are being taken out, where most of the research papers are coming out on this right now, obviously this is around US and China really taking a lead on that. But that being said, I think still there's a lot for Europe to play in this space too when it comes to legislation and to be developing some of the regulatory frameworks around what is ethical and trustworthy AI. So right now I see it as a cooperation between both those who are leading on the front end of AI, but also those who are really thinking about what are some of the ethical guidelines that should shape our technological future, and in particular, how we're using AI.
Great. Karina?
Sure. Hey, Melissa. So I will say, of course, the EU is the first to release horizontal rules for AI governance. This is a pretty significant task, and so many people agree this is necessary, right? And I think even as Google CEO Sundar Pichai said back in January 2020, AI is too important not to regulate. So with the EU taking input from more than 1,000 responses, just a big task. So EU really taking the lead there. I would say, in addition to the EU, of course, the US, China, Singapore, India, Brazil, and others are all recognizing the importance of investing in and developing AI, and hundreds of organizations around the world have published principles in responsible development. So yeah, the last thing I'll note, as a technical practitioner, we know that global technical standards, sharing best practices will be an important component of global governance, and we really applaud these efforts by the OECD, GPI, ISO, ML Commons, and others.
Great. Yi?
Thank you for the invitation first. And I think I like the background of this conference. Is really what we're talking about. I think the global landscape of AI is a network. So you see many pivotal nodes right there, but there's no single, pivotal node. There are many pivotal nodes that connect us together. So in this case, I think there's no one who's really leading, and also there's really not necessary to have someone who is leading, because we need a global story that for pushing forward AI as an enabling technology to benefit the humanity. So my answer would be, there's no one who is really leading, and there's no need to lead.
Okay, interesting. David, would you agree, or do you have a clear vision of who leads?
Well, let me give you a different dissection, and I agree with all the previous speakers, but I think who's leading is the private sector at the moment, and not the governments, and specifically not the defense and security organizations like NATO. So we have some catching up to do when it comes down to getting grips around AI, making sure that we get the right regulations in place, as was mentioned by one previous speaker, and make sure that we fully understand the depth of this rapid development that is taking place a bit in the side of our scope up to now, I have to say.
Great, thank you. Now, as Karina mentioned, there are tons of different initiatives around AI. The OECD, the GPI, and Europe, the European Commission just published its own AI standards. What do you guys think? What's the best platform or way to encourage more international collaboration? Karina, why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah. So I would just say at the beginning, right, of course, it's important for countries and regional bodies to identify values that are important to them. As you noted, though, Melissa, of course, ideally through this process, there should be a harmonized global approach to AI governance, right? This can really drive the uptake of trustworthy AI and ensure that there isn't a confusing patchwork of rules that are conflicting around the world. The one thing I'll note, actually, if you look around the world, there have been many hundreds of AI principles published globally, right? And there actually are common values. Even if you look across the EU communication on AI, the Google AI Principles, OECD, the Beijing AI Principles, there are common stated values for AI to be socially beneficial, trustworthy, robust, and open. I think the ideal is to really continue to have these conversations, to look at what others are saying, to learn from each other, and to find as many common denominators as possible to drive responsible development, while of course allowing for national and local decision making. And I mentioned this earlier, but I do think global technical standards and continuing to share best practices will be an important part of this process.
Great, thanks. Now, David, NATO is working on its own AI strategy, which is out later this summer. Do you think that you would be a very practical way to encourage AI collaboration?
Yes, definitely. I think that we've stated as allies that we see that NATO is the transatlantic platform to discuss all the security and defense related issues regarding EDTs, and AI is of course a very prominent one in that list at the moment. So this is what we're working on towards the AI strategy. I mean, NATO doesn't make legislation, but we can discuss what we think are the principles of responsible use that we all adhere to. We can say what are our democratic values and principles that we want to see incorporated in AI. How do we protect AI in our countries from foreign investment that is unwanted? How do we protect this industry from malign actors, so to speak? So there's plenty of opportunity for NATO to play a role as a platform in AI and the further development.
Great, thank you. Anne-Marie, you're in Silicon Valley. You're European tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. How do you feel like Europe's AI efforts and initiatives are being received there? Are you getting lots of airtime with people?
Absolutely. I think there's a massive interest for understanding how the European Union is thinking around this, how we are addressing these issues, and not least, I think, with the recent piece of legislation coming from the Commission exactly around AI, there's obviously a lot of focus, because what we saw with GDPR is that Europe can really, I think, set the global bar for how we think about the protection around some of these technologies. What I think is one of the most important pieces around the AI legislation, looking at this from a European perspective, but particularly in a transatlantic perspective too, is to say this is really an approach where trustworthy and innovative AI are two sides of the same coin. This is not an oxymoron. By this, I really mean, striking a balance between setting the right requirements and safeguards, and in order to achieve trustworthy AI. And on the other coin of that saying, this is also about facilitating and promoting innovation. Because at the end of the day, when we talk around legislation on AI, this is not only about managing the risk, but I think posing the fundamental question of how do we develop AI that are tackling some of the greatest social environmental challenges of our time? Obviously, top of that agenda is the global climate crisis. But secondly, a number of issues, whether we're talking healthcare, environment, biodiversity, education. And we need to be, I think from a European perspective, thinking through how do we create incentives, voluntary schemes for companies to live up to the ideals, not only of trustworthy AI, but AI that is helping us solve some of the biggest challenges of our time, because that is where the potential of AI lies. And I think it's also where citizens, policymakers, companies alike can find common ground on the much broader purpose of why are we developing AI if it's not ultimately beneficial to citizens, to some of the main global agendas that we have.
Great. Now, the European Commission's AI Act creates a product safety framework, but also has some bans. Now, one of the clear, explicit bans is government-conducted social scoring. Now, to me, that reads as clearly a sign to China that these practices aren't necessarily welcome in Europe. How is this received in China?
I think everything has two coins. Every coin has two sides. So when you introduce AI as assisting technology to regulate the society, there could be some motivations where AI could assist the decision making, not really directly affecting decision making. So there, actually, you see some interesting tryings like social credit system, some local versions, I would say. It helps in some cases. Well, on the other hand, you have to get to know the technical bottlenecks right there. That AI, for now, it's still a information processing techniques, not really with understanding, but really to process those information. So when you want to derive decisions based on those processed information, there could be risks right there. So you have to make a balance. So our tryings would be, the experience would be really to keep this kind of a system as an assistant for decision making, not as a decision maker. So that's something that I could share. Also, that I have heard that similar tryings was in either United States or Europe, but in different versions or by some companies. I think we have to have some common understanding that the current technology of AI is not safe enough as a decision maker, but can be as an enabling technology to provide some supporting materials.
Great. And have you heard, I mean, going back to my questions, I mean, have you heard a reaction from the Chinese government to this EU proposal, or has it been widely ignored?
I don't think that it has been widely ignored. It has been, as always, discussed in many cases. But I would like to go back to the interesting question that you raised. So what is the platform really for international collaboration? That I would go for someone like UNESCO, where you can actually come to the consensus and to really share the experiences worldwide in a more inclusive platform with diverse cultures. As for the second question that you raised, what is the feedbacks of the European tryings? I think many of us learn a lesson from them that you could have some concerns. The interesting point that I would like to raise is that maybe we need to classify AI applications into different levels of risks. I think that's a lesson that can be learned both for China, in many Asian countries, and also in the United States. But for those like the social credit system or the surveillance system that can be used by companies or by the governments, I think this is related to how culture and technology co-shape the governance systems. It's very related to how the governments and their citizens are actually interacting with each other. The mutual trust between the governments and the citizens. But I think this is totally different when you consider about different countries. So you have to go back to cultures and the interactive patterns among governments and citizens, so that those discussions will be more effective and valuable.
Great, thank you. Now, Anne-Marie, what do you think about what Yi just said? Sorry.
I mean, I think there's a lot to uncover. One thing is, obviously, I think when the European Union puts out some of this legislation, how it is, I think how is it met in different countries matters a lot, because from a European perspective, part of some of the efforts here is really also on leading on the legislation of how do we shape technology going forward? How do we ensure a balanced approach, one that, as I was saying to before, both I think focuses on the innovative side and keeping that innovative edge, while at the same time making sure that we have a risk-based framework that is technology neutral, that is proportionate, and where we make sure that the higher risk, the more requirements we set to that. That being said, one of the things that I see across, whether we're talking the Beijing Principles, as was mentioned before, ISO, IEEE, from Google's AI Principles to a lot of the other that's been out, I think a lot of them are actually based around some of the same values. We talk, how does AI ultimately help humanity? How is it, risk appropriate? How is it trust-based? All of these issues. What I think is important is then how do we translate into reality? How do we make sure there is accountability in the systems? How do we make sure that both on the industry side, on the government side, on civil society side, that we're making sure we live up to these principles? How does that look for AI development, not just tomorrow, but 5 years and 10 years from now? How do we integrate it into our research institutions, into industries, and into a public-private collaboration? And one of the ways that we've been thinking around this is really at the one pace saying we need to have, very clear boundaries, particularly in some of these very challenging, whether we're talking social credit scores, facial recognition, some of the aspects of technology that are much more discussed right now. And then at the same time, how can we build voluntary standards? One of the ways that we in Denmark have been looking at this is to see this voluntary labeling scheme, one that is quite a practical way, I think, to achieve this goal, one that would make it easier for companies to choose responsible and ethical solutions, and creating a real demand. This is also about supply and demand. And right now, I think demanding both from consumers, from citizens, from businesses, much more of these ethical ways of engaging around technology. From the Danish side, we're actually launching in Denmark a voluntary labeling scheme on IT security and responsible use of data this autumn. I think this is one approach, I think, to actually engaging and making sure these principles trickle down and becomes tangible when we talk about AI applications and AI use in a quite broader sense.
Great. Now, Karina, as Google, there's a lot of, as we can see, geopolitics and tension around AI collaboration. How do you work around that as a global company?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I would note is we as a company had to identify what are our own values, right? In the same way that a lot of different countries and regions like the EU and a lot of organizations globally are identifying their values. We've identified a set of Google AI principles, 7 things that we think AI should do or be, and then 4 types of applications that we will not pursue. And we've been very clear about our own values, and we're using this as an ethical charter to really guide all of the technologies that we will pursue as a global company. Versus not figuring out how to navigate, international competition as well as collaboration. I think just a couple points here. I think we note as a company, of course, AI is important for national success. It's important for business success. It's certainly been critical to our ability to deliver on our mission, and we know it's going to be continued to be important as we go forward. Right, there are opportunities to improve in healthcare, economic opportunity in sectors across the board, and of course, public services. I think this is reflected in our Google AI principles as well as the many national AI principles we've seen over the last many years. However, as you note, Melissa, AI is also important for global success, right? There are problems that no one country can solve. All of us know about these, right? Sustainability, addressing climate change, the COVID pandemic. These are things that countries and also industry, academia, nonprofits, institutions around the world, we're all going to have to cooperate on these. And AI really provides an opportunity to accelerate progress. And if I could just pick up on one point that Anne-Marie made about trustworthy and innovation really being, 2 sides of the same coin, I think that's absolutely right? We oftentimes think about how constraints actually lead to more creativity. So identifying these principles, having rules, having a set constraints can actually lead to a lot more innovation down the road. To take one example, right, oftentimes people will think, well, with privacy and machine learning, of course, you need as much data as possible to learn. And one of the things that we've seen is actually you can have privacy and machine learning. What about techniques like federated learning, where you've got constraints of privacy that led to the invention of these types of technologies? So yeah, I think they really do go hand in hand.
Great, thank you. Now, David, I'd like to go back to NATO's strategy. Could you tell us a bit more about what that'll include and what are the kind of main sticking points or bones of contention right now?
Well, in an organization with 30 allies based on consensus, there's always challenge to get to a finishing line. And if you look at all the principles of responsible use that are in place, whether it's Google's, whether it's the US, whether it's France, you can see that they're all roughly the same, but there are differences. So what we're trying to do at NATO is to bridge these in a way that reflect our democratic values and our ethical principles. So yes, principles of responsible use are definitely high on the agenda within the strategy for two reasons. One is we need to make clear to industry and our own armed forces what standards we expect AI to adhere to in the security and defense realm. Two, it's also to signal trust to our own populations. That the use of AI within the defense community will be bound by strict ethical principles. So that's one big part of it. The second one is to make our armed forces more AI and digital savvy. So we need to make this transformation. We can see that this is the new reality that we'll have to deal with also on the battlefield. So how do we get our people up to speed when it comes down to dealing with AI? In assisted decision-making, in processing data. The third one is how do we make sure that we protect our own data from the 30 nations that feed into it in the military sense? How do we protect that data? How do we make sure that all the allies know that they can trust NATO with that data? And how do we then harness that data in order to make sure that we have AI that runs on specific NATO data in a trusted way? So there's plenty of avenues to walk into, but the most difficult part, I think, is how do you operationalize it? So once you have a principle, what is it worth if you can't actually verify or test that every AI application that you use adheres to those principles? So yes, there will be validation, there will be testing, there will be co-development. So it will require a whole string of events in order to make sure that when AI is used by one of the allies, that they can be sure that they use it as it was meant to be based on this strategy.
Now, Eric Schmidt, who was on just now and who chairs the National Security Committee of AI and is also for Google's former boss, he said that the biggest threat to the US in AI is China, and that's why the US must invest in military AI. Do you share that view, David?
Well, I do think, as I started out, that we've been on the sideline of this new technology for too long. I mean, if we look at the age of GPS or even the start of the internet, you could see that the defense sector and the security implications were front and center when it came down to incorporating new technologies. That is not the case now. So yes, we need to get to grips with the security implications of AI from a defensive and an offensive perspective before we corner ourselves in. I think that's one of the things that you're related to when it comes down to Mr. Smith, who said that you shouldn't be too soon in excluding the use of AI in the defense sector. I think that NATO's role is to bring that perspective to the table. What do we see happening in other countries when it comes down to the use of AI in the military, and how do we defend against that? And the latter part should always be in line with our ethical principles. And just to quote on Karina, if that makes it more difficult, great, that'll feed into more innovation. But our principles are front and center of everything we will do with AI.
Great, thank you. Now, what do you think of this narrative that Schmidt and others are pushing, that China is a big threat and it's like a bad actor, and the West should collaborate together, against China? Yeah, what do you think of that?
I think this is basically. I think this is a really silly idea because actually, as a developing country like China. I don't think we don't really have an interest to use AI to create any threat to any other countries, because we're actually focusing on using AI as an enabling technology to power up our economy, social management, and also the environmental good, and then to use AI as an enabling technology to help the the developing countries. So I think these are the major interests. As far as my own understanding, although I don't really have any position to represent the government. So, and also, like I said, the idea of AI global cooperation is really to build a network with many pivotal nodes that leading us to the future. So I think both China and the US and also many nodes in the EU are those pivotal nodes. But I don't see that they are, kind of competing with each other for the future, because no one is really leading the future of AI by just a single one node. And I also think that many citations from that describe China to create the so-called V Center is really a misleading translation from the original Chinese, because in Chinese, when we are talking about V Center, we're using the Chinese word 中央 instead of the center, which means 中心. Actually, the center that means a network with many centers. So I think for global cooperation, you have to remove these kind of misleading concepts to really, and then to look for the future.
Great. I have a audience question for you, Yi. What do you think are the points in common between China, US, and the EU that will be a good starting point for a global vision on AI led by the three states?
Thank you. I would like to share the story on developing the Beijing AI Principles. When we released the principles, actually on MIT Technology Review, they have a report saying that, we were thinking that the Chinese were not talking about privacy, human rights, because kind of forbidden words in their culture, but it seems no, the Beijing AI Principles does mention these kind of understanding. Well, in this case, not to engage China is our own problem. So that's from a professor at MIT. So I think that's the real story. That actually, in many cases, we don't really have an English translation for our official policy document. And then people think that we're not talking about it, and then we're not believing it. No, it's not the case. So I think something which is really important is like what you said, to raise the consensus and then to look for the differences and to narrow down the differences. I think something which is really interesting to build on top of what everything else is really about how we see let's say the risks that AI could bring us, and how we perceive AI as an enabling technology to power up economy and also the environmental good. So I think that's the starting point. We're realizing human dignity, human values, fundamental human rights, and then to create a better world for humanity. I think that's the foundation, both in our national governance principles and also in EU and the United States version.
Now you say that, but then at the same time, we hear reports that there are lots of human rights violations that are, AI-powered human rights violations, for example, against the Uyghurs. I mean, how does that work? If, how do you square that?
But to me, actually, you have to read more news, which is not fake. So that's my only suggestion. So you have to hear multiple voices, not only from the many of the fake media. And so that's my own suggestion. There are many reports, even from the Western media, talking about the facts, what's really happening in China. Or I would suggest that you go to Xinjiang yourself, and then to see what really happens, and then to just, move things forward.
I'd like a reaction from Anne-Marie. What did you think of what Yi just said?
I think when we start to look at some of the points in common when we talk artificial intelligence between the EU, the US, and China, I think it really comes on the opportunity side. I mean, the past year has shown us that as a global pandemic, and we're expecting much more of that to come in the future, unfortunately. How do we develop an effective response? I see artificial intelligence play a huge role in vaccine development when we look in the future. A second point is around climate change, as Yi also mentioned. If we are to realistically achieve the Paris Agreement's climate goals, that is going to require unprecedented collaboration, not least on AI, to make sure that these technologies are delivering for some of the, I think humanity's greatest challenges. That being said, and to the point before, there are also differences, of course. We've seen how AI has taken center stage geopolitically, both as a tool for cooperation, I think for addressing some of the important pieces, but also at times as a weapon. And we need to navigate some of the security implications. But I think we do that best and foremost by engaging in a dialogue, by insisting that there is ways to both for governments to engage, but also with industry, because as I said, was said before, and I think what Karina was also speaking to, this is not only governments, industry, and I live in Silicon Valley, so I see it firsthand every day. The industry is really taking a lead on developing new generation AI. How are we going to be using this in the future? So we need to figure out a way to make progress on dialogue, understanding, and then recognizing there are some places where we fall short of maybe finding mutual agreements, but we need to kind of insist on some of that global collaboration. And then at the same time, with like-minded countries, with strong allies, and such as NATO is also suggesting, building our capabilities in this, but we cannot shy away from also insisting that there has to be some sort of global governance, some sort of global collaboration, not least on the positive side of AI applications.
Karina, do you have anything to add to this? I saw your eyebrows going up a bit in the previous.
Yeah, I think the last point that I'll note here, picking up on Anne-Marie's point of dialogue, David said, everybody's got principles. How do you operationalize them? I think that is the tricky part. I would say transparency is really key here, right? So really everybody, as they're working to develop AI, as they're thinking about practices, really sharing what they're learning, sharing the kind of decisions that they're making, and enabling this global dialogue for people to learn and also identify where can we iterate, how can people improve, where are some of the differences, how can we resolve them. I'll note at Google, certainly we've been doing this for the last 3 years since we released our own AI principles. Every quarter we update, we have a set of recommended AI practices, technical practices and the like on our website. Every quarter we keep these up to date because we want to keep sharing what we're learning. I know actually we call them recommended practices right now, not yet best practices, because we think it's still early and people are still learning what the best is, but we do think that element of transparency and sharing is going to be critical.
Can I also add on
does Google sell? Oh, please go on.
Can I also add on? Thank you. I like the idea from our Google colleague about transparency. I think my observation to many of the AI principles worldwide is that actually whether they're realistic for landing in a technical way. For example, when you're using deep learning system, this is not really transparent. So you cannot say AI must be transparent, otherwise you cannot use deep learning. So we actually need to improve the level of transparency as AI develops. So these are the technological reality, I would say. And also on the other hand, like in GDPR, people like the idea of data erasure, which we also like. And in our Chinese principles, we're talking about data erasure. But actually, when data are very easily to be erased in databases, but when the data are captured in the AI model, actually, there's no way to erase the data unless you retrain the AI model. So it's very beautiful to talk about data erasure in the AI world, but actually in a realistic world, actually, data cannot be erased in the AI models directly. So we have to talk about the hard point on landing those AI principles and then to solve them all together as a community.
Do you think, I'd like to ask you all, I mean, do you think the EU's AI proposal could become a global standard? We have just under a minute left, so I'd like some quick answers. why don't we start with Karina?
Yes, I think that certainly, and we'd expect that as, following the EU proposal, that other countries around the world, I think a lot of people are paying attention. Certainly, if not becoming the exact standard, I'm really starting an important dialogue and identifying important points that we need to address as a global community.
Great, thank you. Just a quick fire round. David, thoughts?
Yes, and also hooking into the last question, I think they do, because these technologies are pervasive and they are global. So if we don't incorporate our own ethical principles into it and make sure that our state systems are reflected in the way that we govern these technologies, then we run big risks. So I would be all in favor of that.
Great. And Yi?
I think the EU version will play as an important part of the global landscape. But you also have to collaborate with China and the United States and many other countries in the framework of the United Nations. That's my short answer.
Great. And Anne-Marie, thank you.
Melissa, I very much hope so. I think one of the greatest success when we've seen on technology regulation, in the past couple of years has been GDPR. My new home state, California, has a CCPA regulation, particularly around data protection, that's been very, I think, influenced by GDPR. So sometimes by taking the ambitious approach and I think setting a framework, and I think the AI framework that's been coming out of the current legislation, I think it's future oriented. I think it's balancing between risk on one side, but also on opportunities from amazing innovation on the other side. So I very much hope that this will become not just a European, but one that can serve as a blueprint for the rest of the world. And that's why I've been so excited to engage in this discussion today and see that we're kind of globally represented in making sure this is not only a discussion among EU member states, but also with industry, with partners around the world, with countries from all the way in the East to all the way in the West.
Fantastic. Thank you so much all. We're out of time, but this was a really fascinating conversation. And thank you all. Now, stay tuned, viewers. I'll be back online in just a few minutes, and we'll have a really, really interesting conversation about AI developments in the global south, and we'll have guests from all over the world. So stay tuned and see you soon.